The boy was 15 years old. His name was Elias Thorne, and in the autumn of 1880, he was all that remained of his family line on a hard patch of earth in the Dakota Territory. His world had been reduced to a 160-acre plot of unforgiving prairie, a small, weathered cabin that his father had built, and two Belgian draft horses, Solomon and Sheba, whose quiet strength was the only inheritance of value he possessed. His parents had been taken by the fever 2 winters prior, leaving him in a state of abrupt and total self-reliance, a condition the other settlers of Prairie Ridge viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion. It was on October 3, 1880, that the disquiet began to settle in his bones. It was a feeling he had been taught to recognize, a lesson imparted not with words, but with quiet observation at his father's side. The geese had flown south 2 weeks earlier than usual, their formations tight and urgent against a sky that held a strange, bruised purple hue at dusk. The muskrats along the creek were building their lodges with unusually thick walls of mud and cattails, and the woolly bear caterpillars he found near the woodpile wore exceptionally wide bands of black. These were the old signs, the almanac of the earth, and they all spoke the same grim prophecy. A winter of savage, unprecedented cold was coiling itself to strike. His lean-to, a flimsy structure of scavenged planks and hope, would not suffice. He knew it with a certainty that chilled him more than the increasingly sharp morning air. Solomon and Sheba were his livelihood, his partners in survival. To lose them would be to lose everything. A proper barn of milled lumber was an impossibility. The cost of materials and labor was a fortune he did not have. He possessed a total of $47 in silver coins, the entirety of his parents' savings, tucked away in a small tin box. It was a sum that had to see him and his animals through the entire winter, a meager bulwark against starvation and the cold. The problem consumed his waking thoughts and haunted his short, troubled sleep. He needed a solution born not of money, but of labor and ingenuity. The answer came to him from the memory of his grandfather's tales, stories of the old ways from a land across the sea and of the first people on this continent. It was the principle of the earth itself, the simple, profound truth that several feet below the frost line, the ground maintained a near constant temperature. It was a vast thermal battery, slow to cool and slow to warm. His father had once dug a root cellar based on this very concept, a small cavern that kept their potatoes and carrots from freezing in the deepest cold. If it could protect a potato, Elias reasoned, a larger version could certainly protect a horse. He would not build up into the wind and the snow. He would dig down into the forgiving, steadfast warmth of the earth. On the morning of October 12th, he began. He chose a spot on a gentle, south-facing slope about 50 yards from his cabin, an area that received the maximum possible sun exposure during the short winter days. With twine and wooden stakes, he marked out a precise rectangle in the tough prairie sod. It was to be 20 feet long and 14 feet wide. The dimensions were not arbitrary. He had measured the horses carefully, ensuring they would have enough room to lie down and move about without being cramped. The scale of the undertaking was immense, a testament to his desperation. He picked up his father's spade, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of work, and broke the earth. The sound of the steel slicing through the grass roots was a declaration of intent, a lonely vow made to the vast, empty sky. He was digging a hole for his horses, and it would be the beginning of his trial. It took less than a week for the mockery to begin. Mr. Abernathy was the first. He was a man whose considerable wealth and land holdings had convinced him of his own infallibility. He rode up on a fine chestnut mare, flanked by his usual companions, the sycophantic Mr. Gable and the perpetually scowling Mr. Schmidt. They reined in their horses at the edge of the growing excavation, their shadows stretching long and judgmental in the afternoon sun. Abernathy, a thick man with a face reddened by weather and whiskey, looked down at the boy, who was already chest-deep in the earth, his face slick with sweat despite the autumn chill. "What in God's name is this, boy?" Abernathy's voice was a booming condescension. "Are you burying treasure?" Mr. Gable chuckled, a wheezing, unpleasant sound. "Looks to me like he's digging a grave, Abernathy. A mighty big one." Elias paused, leaning on his spade. He wiped a grimy forearm across his brow and looked up at the three men, his expression unreadable. "It's a shelter, for my horses, for the winter." The three men exchanged glances, a current of shared disbelief and amusement passing between them. Mr. Schmidt, a man whose pessimism was his defining trait, spat a stream of tobacco juice near the edge of the pit. "A shelter? In a ditch? Son, that's the single most fool-headed thing I've ever seen, and I've seen a man try to shear a pig." "The ground stays warm," Elias stated simply. His voice was quiet but firm, lacking any hint of deference. "It'll be warmer than any barn in this valley once the snow falls." This statement was met with a fresh round of derisive laughter. Abernathy shook his head, a pantomime of paternal disappointment. "Listen to me, Thorne. I knew your father. He was a good man, but he had some strange notions. Seems he passed them on to you. Animals need to be above ground, with a proper roof to keep the snow off and walls to break the wind. What you're making there is a death trap, a mud hole that'll fill with snow and ice and freeze those fine animals of yours solid. It's a tomb, not a shelter." "The roof will be solid," Elias countered, his gaze unwavering. "And it will have drainage." "A roof," Abernathy scoffed, gesturing at the pile of excavated earth. "And what will you make it out of? Dirt and wishes? Take some advice, boy. Fill this foolish hole back in. I'll make you a fair offer for those Belgians. $50 for the pair. It's more than they're worth, but I'd hate to see them wasted on account of your stubbornness." The offer was an insult disguised as charity. A healthy draft horse was worth twice that amount, and his were prime stock. It was a vulture's bid, an attempt to profit from the misfortune he was so confidently predicting. "They're not for sale, Mr. Abernathy," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more defiant than a shout. He turned his back on them and drove the spade into the hard-packed clay with a grunt of effort. The message was clear. The conversation was over. Abernathy's face darkened. He was not a man accustomed to being dismissed, especially by a boy half his age. "Have it your way," he snarled. "But don't come crying to me when you're cutting their frozen carcasses up for meat. We'll all remember this. We'll call it Thorne's Folly." The men laughed as they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving Elias alone with the name they had given his endeavor. He did not watch them go. He just kept digging. The work was a brutal catechism of labor. Every day from sunup to sundown, Elias was in the pit. The topsoil gave way to a thick, heavy layer of clay that clung to his shovel and made every load in the wheelbarrow a monumental effort. Below that, he hit a layer of shale, which forced him to use the pickaxe. The jarring impact of steel on rock traveling up the handle and into the bones of his arms and shoulders. He worked with a methodical, relentless rhythm, his lean frame hardening into sinew and muscle. He ate standing up, quick meals of bread and jerky, his mind constantly calculating, planning, and refining the design of the shelter. The townspeople made his project a form of local entertainment. Families would ride out in their buggies on a Sunday afternoon to stare and whisper, watching the boy toil in his ever-deepening hole. The name stuck. Thorne's Folly was on everyone's lips, a cautionary tale in the making about the dangers of youthful pride and unconventional ideas. By the first week of November, the excavation was complete. The pit was a perfect rectangle, its earthen walls rising 10 feet from a packed clay floor. The final dimensions were 20 feet in length, 14 feet in width, and 10 feet deep. He had moved, by his own calculation, over 2,800 cubic feet of earth, one wheelbarrow at a time. The most difficult part of the dig had been the entrance, a gently sloping ramp 30 feet long that descended from ground level to the shelter floor. He had carefully graded the slope to ensure the horses could walk down it safely, even in icy conditions, and had packed the clay until it was nearly as hard as stone. The sheer volume of earth he had moved was staggering, a testament to a will that bordered on obsession. Now, the construction phase began. He used a portion of his precious savings, a total of $9.65, to purchase heavy support beams and rough-cut lumber from the mill in the next town over, avoiding the judgmental eyes of the merchants in Prairie Ridge. He reinforced the earthen walls with a framework of salvaged timbers he'd pulled from a collapsed shed at the far end of his property, preventing any possibility of a cave-in. The most critical element was the roof. He laid the thickest beams, each 8 inches square, across the 14-foot width of the pit, spacing them 4 feet apart. Across these main supports, he laid a perpendicular grid of smaller 2x6 planks, creating a dense, solid lattice. The cost of the nails and bolts required for this assembly came to $1.40. His next task was to make the roof weatherproof and insulating. For this, he turned back to the earth itself. Using a sod cutter he borrowed from a sympathetic old farmer on the far side of the county, he began harvesting thick squares of prairie sod, the deep roots of the buffalo grass making them incredibly dense and durable. He worked for days, slicing and lifting the heavy mats of earth and grass, hauling them on the wheelbarrow to the shelter. He laid the sod over the wooden frame of the roof, packing it down tightly, overlapping the edges like shingles. He applied 2 full layers, creating a living roof nearly a foot thick. This was the heart of his design. The sod would not only shed water and block the wind, but its immense thermal mass would absorb heat from the sun during the day and radiate it slowly back into the shelter at night. Furthermore, once the snows came, the roof would disappear beneath a thick, insulating blanket, using the very thing his detractors feared as a final, perfect layer of protection. He was not merely building a pit. He was engineering a system based on sound principles of thermodynamics. He understood that he needed ventilation to prevent moisture buildup and to ensure fresh air for the animals. He spent a precious $1.50 on 2 10-foot lengths of 6-inch stovepipe. He installed one at the higher northern end of the sloped roof and the other at the lower southern end. The warmer, moist air exhaled by the horses would naturally rise and exit through the higher pipe, while cooler, fresh air would be drawn in through the lower one, creating a slow, constant, passive air exchange. To the townspeople, they were just 2 odd pipes sticking out of a mound of dirt. To Elias, they were the lungs of his creation. Inside, he attended to the details with the same meticulous care. He dug a 2-foot deep sump pit in the lowest corner and filled it with gravel to handle any potential meltwater or seepage, ensuring the floor would remain dry. He built a sturdy manger along one wall and a small enclosed feed bin in the corner to protect the oats from moisture and pests. He even fashioned a heavy door for the ramp entrance from 3 layers of thick planking, cross-braced and fitted with a heavy iron latch. The final cost for all materials, lumber, nails, pipe, and rope, came to a total of $27.82, a significant portion of his savings, but an investment he believed was the only thing standing between his horses and certain death. Throughout this process, the ridicule was a constant, biting wind. Mr. Abernathy made it a point to ride by every few days, his pronouncements of doom becoming more confident as the weather grew colder. The The first heavy rain is going to collapse that sod roof of yours, boy. You'll drown those poor beasts in a river of mud, he'd shout. A week later it was, that dirt floor will turn to a frozen bog. They'll get hoof rot before they get a chance to freeze to death. Every prediction was delivered with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been wrong because he had never dared to be different. Elias never argued. He never defended his work. He simply nodded politely and continued his task, his silence a more profound rebuttal than any argument he could have made. He let the work speak for itself. By the first week of December, Thorn's folly was complete. From a distance, it was barely visible, just a low, green mound on the hillside, the two stovepipes standing like lonely sentinels. He spent the next 2 weeks methodically stocking it. He used the last of his money, the final $19 and some change, to purchase as much hay and oats as he could afford. He stacked the hay bales against the northern wall of the interior, adding another layer of insulation. He filled the bin with oats. He hauled water from his well, filling 2 large wooden barrels inside the shelter, knowing the well itself might freeze or become inaccessible. He moved his own meager supplies, flour, salt pork, beans, and firewood, into his small cabin, preparing for his own siege. He had done everything he could. He had wagered his labor, his meager fortune, and the lives of his animals on a principle he had learned from the earth. Now, all he could do was wait for the sky to prove him right. The wait was not long. The signs had been clear, and nature kept its promises. The reckoning arrived on December 24th, 1880. It began not with snow, but with a terrifying stillness. The air grew unnaturally calm and heavy, and the temperature, which had been a mild 20 degrees Fahrenheit at noon, began to plummet. By 3 in the afternoon, it was 0. By 5, it was 10 below. A strange, leaden gray light filtered through a sky thick with unseen ice crystals. Elias felt the change in the pressure of the air, a deep-chested ache that was the storm's harbinger. He did not hesitate. He put on his heaviest coat, pulled his hat down low, and went to the lean-to. Solomon and Sheba were restless, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their large, intelligent eyes wide with animal apprehension. "Come on," he said softly, his voice a calm anchor in the growing dread. "Time to go to your new home." He led them not with a rope, but with his voice. They trusted him implicitly. They followed him to the low mound on the hill, and, with only a moment's hesitation at the dark entrance, they walked down the long, gentle ramp and into the cavernous space below. The air inside was immediately, noticeably different. It was still and quiet, the biting edge of the cold completely gone. The temperature within the earth-sheltered structure was holding at a stable and comparatively balmy 38 degrees. Elias led them to the manger, which he had filled with fresh hay. They began to eat, their anxiety visibly melting away in the calm, secure environment. He checked his supplies one last time, patted each horse on its massive neck, and then walked back up the ramp. Just as he pulled the heavy wooden door shut, sealing them inside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the gentle, fluffy flakes of a picturesque winter's day, but small, hard, granular pellets, driven by a rising wind. He had barely made it the 50 yards back to his cabin when the full fury of the blizzard broke. It was as if a switch had been thrown in the heavens. The wind exploded from a breeze into a deafening, shrieking gale, a physical wall of force that threatened to tear the cabin from its foundations. The world outside his small window dissolved into a churning, horizontal chaos of white. It was not snowing in the conventional sense. The sky was falling. The temperature continued its free fall, reaching 20, then 30, then an almost unimaginable 40 degrees below zero. The wind chill was a lethal abstraction, a number that meant instant, frozen death for any living thing caught unprotected within it. Inside his cabin, Elias worked to survive. He stuffed rags into every crack around the door and the single window. He lit his small, pot-bellied stove, feeding it sparingly with the firewood he had stacked against the interior wall. The stove glowed cherry red, but it fought a losing battle against the invasive cold that seeped through the wooden walls. The sound was a physical assault, a constant, high-pitched scream of wind that vibrated through the very floorboards. It was the sound of nature's rage, indifferent and absolute. Through it all, his primary concern was not for himself, but for the 2 lives sealed away in the earthen mound on the hill. He had done the calculations. He had trusted the principles. But this storm was something beyond calculation, a meteorological monster that defied all precedent. He could only hope that the Earth's embrace was as strong as he believed it to be. Meanwhile, less than 2 miles away, at the Abernathy Ranch, the conventional wisdom was dying a very loud and violent death. Mr. Abernathy's barn was his pride and joy. It was a magnificent structure, 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a soaring roof and modern ventilation louvers. It was built, however, entirely above ground. Its walls were single-layer 1-inch planks. In a normal winter, it was perfectly adequate. In this blizzard, it was a trap. The wind, clocked later by a weather station 100 miles away at over 70 miles per hour, struck the broad side of the barn with the force of a battering ram. It found every small crack and turned it into a gaping hole, blasting super-chilled air and needle-like snow directly onto the terrified animals within. Abernathy and his 2 ranch hands were trapped in the main house, listening to the destruction of their livelihood. They heard the high-pitched whinny of freezing horses and the desperate bawling of his prize-winning Hereford cattle. Around midnight on the first night, a sound like a cannon shot echoed over the storm's roar. A massive section of the barn roof had been torn away and sent cartwheeling into the white darkness. The animals inside were now exposed to the full, murderous onslaught of the blizzard. There was nothing Abernathy could do. To step outside would be suicide. He and his men huddled around their fireplace, burning fence posts, and then, in desperation, the fine oak chairs from the dining room, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, their expressions a mask of impotent horror. The same tragic scene was playing out across Prairie Ridge. Mr. Gable lost his entire flock of sheep, their lean-to flattened in the first hours of the storm. Mr. Schmidt's new hog barn, his entire investment for the year, was buried in a 20-foot drift, its occupants silenced by the suffocating weight and the abyssal cold. Every structure built to the accepted standards, every barn and shed standing proud and tall above the ground, was failing. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world ceased to exist. It was a universe of only wind and cold and screaming white. Elias rationed his food and fuel, his small cabin becoming an ice-coated cave. He slept little, the howl of the storm a constant, unnerving companion. He thought of his parents and of the quiet wisdom they had tried to instill in him. He thought of the laughter of the men who had called him a fool. He did not feel anger or a desire for revenge. He felt only a deep, abiding sorrow for the stubbornness of men and a desperate hope that his own unorthodox faith had not been misplaced. On the morning of December 27th, he awoke to an unfamiliar sensation. Silence. The wind had stopped. The sudden absence of the roaring gale was more jarring than its presence had been. He looked out his small, frosted window and saw a world transformed, a landscape of alien beauty and terrifying power. The prairie was gone, replaced by a rolling ocean of snow, sculpted by the wind into massive drifts and deep, shadowed valleys. The sun was intensely bright, its light reflecting off the endless white with a painful, crystalline glare. His cabin was half buried, a drift sweeping up to the eaves on the north side. His first thought was for the horses. He pulled on his boots and coat and forced his cabin door open against a wall of packed snow. The air was so cold, it felt like a physical blow to the lungs, a searing, dry cold that stole the breath. He waded through waist-deep snow towards the shelter. At first, his heart sank. The entire mound was gone, vanished beneath a colossal drift that rose 15 feet above where the roof should have been. Only the very top 6 inches of the northern ventilation pipe was visible, a tiny black snorkel in a sea of white. There was no way to get to the main door. Panic gave way to methodical thought. The ventilation shaft was his only way in. He returned to his cabin and retrieved his spade. For over an hour he dug, frantically at first, then with a more measured pace, clearing the snow from around the pipe. He finally exposed the roof, a solid, frozen cap of sod and snow. Using the head of an axe, he carefully broke through the frozen turf and the wooden planks between 2 of the main beams, creating a small, dark opening. "Solomon? Sheba!" he called down into the blackness, his voice tight with anxiety. A soft, welcoming nicker answered him from below. Relief washed over him so powerfully his knees felt weak. He lowered a lantern on a rope, its yellow light illuminating an impossible scene of peace. The 2 massive horses stood calmly at their manger, turning to look up at him with curious eyes. The air that rose from the opening was cool, but not frigid, and carried the warm, earthy scent of hay and horse. He scrambled down, dropping the last few feet to the floor. The interior was dry and secure. The temperature, he noted from a small thermometer he had hung on a post, was 36 degrees. While the world outside had frozen, the shelter had held. The earth had kept its promise. The horses were not just alive. They were completely unharmed, warm, fed, and calm. He ran a hand down Solomon's powerful flank, feeling the warmth of the animal, and for the first time in 3 days, he allowed himself to believe that they had survived. After ensuring the horses had fresh water from the barrels, which had not frozen, he knew he had to check on his neighbors. His sense of duty warred with the memory of their scorn, but in the end, there was no choice. In a world this harsh, survival was a communal act, even if the community had rejected him. He fashioned a pair of crude snowshoes from barrel staves and rope, and began the arduous trek towards the Abernathy Ranch. The journey was surreal. He walked over fences he could not see, their tops buried 10 feet below his feet. The landscape was utterly alien. When he finally crested the ridge that overlooked Abernathy's property, he stopped, stunned by the devastation. The magnificent barn was a skeleton. Its walls were splintered and breached, and the roof was a jagged collection of broken timbers. The entire structure was choked with snow. Dotted around the ruin, like grim statues, were the frozen carcasses of Abernathy's prized cattle and horses, some half buried, others frozen solid where they stood. It was a scene of total, catastrophic loss. He made his way to the main house. It was eerily silent. A huge drift was piled against the front door, blocking it completely. He circled the house, wading through snow that was often chest-deep, until he found a window on the south side that was less obstructed. He peered through the frosted glass and saw movement within. He banged his gloved fist on the pane. After a moment, a haggard, smoke-stained face appeared. It was Abernathy, but he was almost unrecognizable. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt and smudged with soot. He stared at Elias as if seeing a ghost. With great effort, Abernathy managed to unlatch the window. "Thorn, is that you? How are you alive?" His voice was a dry, cracking whisper. "My shelter held," Elias said simply. "Are you all right, Mr. Abernathy?" "We're freezing," the man croaked. "No more wood. No food left. Gable and Schmidt are here. We were checking on the stock when it hit. We've been trapped." It took Elias another 2 hours of relentless digging with his spade, which he had carried with him, to clear the front door. When he finally pushed it open, the scene inside was one of utter desperation. The three men, the town's most prosperous and arrogant ranchers, were huddled together under a pile of blankets in the center of the grand living room. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and despair. The furniture was a wreck. Every chair, the dining table, even the floorboards in one corner had been chopped up and burned in the fireplace. On the hearth lay the last of their fuel, a small pile of books. Mr. Gable had severe frostbite on his hands, which were swollen and turning a dark, waxy blue. Mr. Schmidt was shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering in a violent, unending rhythm. They stared at Elias as he stood in the doorway, a boy of 15, healthy and strong, framed by the blinding white light of the snow. He was the picture of life and competence in their tomb of failure. Not one of them had lost a family member in the fever. Not one of them had faced the world alone since childhood. Not one of them had endured weeks of public ridicule for a conviction they held. And not one of them, in that moment, could deny that they had been profoundly and catastrophically wrong. Elias did not say, "I told you so." He did not gloat. His vindication was not in words, but in action. He returned to his cabin, hitched Solomon to a makeshift sledge, and loaded it with firewood, blankets, and a pot of the bean soup he had cooked for himself. He brought it to the Abernathy house, his powerful horse moving through the deep snow with an ease that seemed miraculous to the weakened men. He helped them splint and wrap Gable's hands. He started a proper fire in their hearth and heated the soup, handing a steaming bowl to each of the humbled patriarchs. They took it with trembling hands, their pride shattered into a million pieces. It was Abernathy who finally broke the silence, his eyes fixed on the floor. "The horses, boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're Belgians. They made it?" "They're fine," Elias replied. "Warm and dry." Abernathy finally looked up, his eyes meeting the boys'. There was no condescension left in them, only a vast, aching shame. "Thorn's Folly," he whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "We called it Thorn's Folly. We laughed at you. And your hole in the ground is the only thing that worked. My barn, my animals, all of them, gone, frozen." He choked on the last word, a dry sob shaking his large frame. In the days that followed, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. The Great Blizzard of 1880, as it came to be known, had devastated the entire region. Dozens of settlers had perished, and the loss of livestock was nearly total. The landscape was littered with the frozen bodies of cattle, sheep, and horses, a grim testament to the failure of conventional, above-ground shelters. Amidst the widespread ruin, one story was told with a sense of awe and reverence. It was the story of the orphan boy who had listened to the earth instead of to men. The structure on the hill was no longer called Thorn's Folly. The settlers began to call it the Winter-Proof Barn, or, more simply, Thorn's Hope. Men who had once mocked Elias now came to him, hats in hand, to study his design. They measured the dimensions, noted the ventilation system, and marveled at the simple genius of the sod roof. Elias, with quiet dignity, explained the principles to them: thermal mass, geothermal heat, passive air exchange. He held nothing back. He was not a boy anymore. He was a teacher, a sage whose wisdom was born of observation, necessity, and the courage to defy popular opinion. The following spring, all across the valley, new structures began to appear. They were not the tall, proud barns of before, but low, humble shelters, dug deep into the protective embrace of the Dakota soil. Elias Thorne had not only saved his own livelihood, he had provided the blueprint for the survival of the entire community. He had endured their scorn and, in the end, had saved them from their own foolishness. His vindication as silent, as profound, and as absolute as the winter earth itself.